Hey, thank you so much for joining us at our Crosspoint Church podcast. Now, if you're new to our podcast or maybe new to our church in general, we're just a bunch of messed up people who don't have it all together, running after a heavenly leader who loves us and meets us right where we are. We hope this message encourages you, builds your faith, and strengthens your confidence as you continue down this journey of what it means to know and follow Jesus. Enjoy this message.
Well, hey, everybody, welcome again to week 3 of A Journey Home. Whether you have been tracking with us for the last several weeks or this is your first time joining us, we are so glad that you're here, and I think that there's something here for all of us today. If we've not met, my name is Abbie, and excited to be with you. Excited whether you're in the room with us or joining us online. Can we give a shout out to those who are online with us, maybe wherever fall break is taking you? Yeah. So glad you're here. So whether you are online or in the room, you just a moment ago spent some time working on page 44 of this guidebook. And I just wanted to kind of clear the air. If as you were doing that, some of the questions were a little bit difficult to answer, you're not alone in that. For me, especially that personal brand question, started to make me feel anxious. And I think the reason why I've identified is I actually, when I was in college, went through this one interview process, and it was a pretty competitive interview, and I was, kind of standing with other people that were being interviewed up in front of this panel of judges, and I was asked to describe myself in one word, and the best answer that I could come up with was me. Needless to say, I did not move on to the next phase of that process, but apparently I haven't gotten much better over the years at answering those kinds of questions. Thankfully, AI can take care of that for us now, so I'll be doing that later. But I would encourage you, whether the answers to those questions came easily or not, to spend some time this week talking to someone else, especially someone else who knows you well. See what else comes up as you have more of a conversation about those questions, about how you see yourself, about how others see you, because I think you might be surprised as you do. And if you are in one of our Journey small groups, you actually are going to have a built-in opportunity to do this week. If you're not in a small group, but you want to be still, it's not too late to join. We'd love to help you get connected in that way. I know I've been hearing from so many of our groups that there's been some really cool experiences so far as groups have been forming and starting to meet over the last couple of weeks. And even for me personally, I was part of planning this series, so I kind of thought I knew what to expect, but there's something about being in that group experience that's really been taking things to a deeper level for me, even than what I expected. So definitely encourage you to get plugged in that way if you haven't yet. Today, though, we are heading toward a turning point. A turn toward home. If you've been with us over the last few weeks, or if you want to catch up online, you'll see that we started this journey in week 1 by talking about how we all have this common condition of not feeling at home. We all have experiences of not feeling like we belong, like we're out of place, like something is just not quite right. And then last week, we began to unpack some of the misconceptions that we may have picked up about God that may actually contribute to those feelings in our lives. Today, though, is really about trust. Because what I've discovered is that this whole journey of finding our way home really boils down to this one question: will I trust God? Will I trust who God says He is? Will I trust who God says I am? So we're going to dive into that. But first, let's take a minute and pray together. God, I thank you that you are here in this moment, in this place with us. And God, that you see us. You see our stories. You know all of the reasons that we carry into this place that may make us weary or wary of trusting. God, you know our hesitations. You know the things that we are working through. And so, God, in these moments, would you help us to be open to what you might want to do in us? May we experience together a taste of what it is like to find our way home in you, with you. Would you teach us, change us, challenge us, grow our capacity to trust you as we see you for who you really are? It's in your name and your character we pray. Amen. So last week, a little bit of a recap, we looked at the best day of Jesus' life. We had to bring this graphic up again, obviously. I really think this was the best day of Jesus' life, the day that he was baptized, when God publicly spoke over him, "You are my beloved son. With you I am well pleased." And then right after this moment, Jesus walks into some of his worst days. 40 days of wandering around in the wilderness, experiencing temptation that had to do with his core identity. And last week, we looked at this story in detail and all the ways that the enemy, the accuser, tried to get Jesus to find his identity by going after other things. He tempted him with his appetite, going after what he wanted, regardless of what God wanted. He tempted him in areas of ambition, tempting him to strive for power as a way of gaining his worth and value in the world. And then there was a temptation that preyed on his desire for approval. And this is the one that we're really going to dive in deeper to today. But first, I want you to notice that Jesus actually chooses to go into the wilderness. In fact, Luke tells us that he was led there by the Spirit of God, which signals to us something that we have to pay attention to, that wilderness experiences are actually a necessary part of the process of transformation in our lives. The experience of wilderness, those places where the pull of temptation is strong, this is something that we all know. Every one of us have seasons where we feel like we are out alone in a desert, not sure how we're going to make it through, not sure whether or not we will make it out. And this is not something that we need to feel shame about. This is a common human experience. And the truth is, there are some things that we can only learn in the wilderness. There is wisdom that we will need for the journey, that we can only gain there. There is strength and skill that we will need for the future, that we can only develop in those spaces. There's moral muscle that we're going to need along the way, that we can only really exercise and strengthen in the midst of struggle. And there is a depth of connection with God that really only comes in those wild, wandering times in our lives. If, in the midst of them, we can learn to follow and trust God in the midst of the unknown. And so if you find yourself today in a place where you feel a lot like you've been wandering around in the wilderness, be encouraged. Perhaps this is exactly where you need to be. Maybe it's a necessary part of the process of what's developing in you now is actually going to serve you in ways that you cannot yet imagine as you find your way home. But at the same time, don't get too comfortable, because the wilderness is not the place where we are meant to stay and settle. See, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness has a lot of similarities to another important story in the Bible, the story of ancient Israel in the wilderness. There's something important that we discover when we look at these two stories side by side and compare them. See, Jesus and every person in his community would have been raised with this defining story of their ancestors, how God had rescued them from slavery in Egypt, had provided for them, had given them what they need, and had over and over told them that they were chosen and loved. One example of this we see in Exodus 19. God says to them, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant, you will be my own special treasure among all the peoples on earth. You will be my kingdom of priests, my holy nation." See, God had given the nation of Israel an identity. Chosen people, holy nation. God was with them and was faithful. Much like here in the story of Jesus that we just looked at, God gives Jesus this identity, beloved son, with whom I am well pleased. But then Israel goes out into the wilderness and gets caught in this cycle of temptation. They keep forgetting who they are. They keep forgetting what God has done for them, the way that God has been with them in the past. And so they end up spending 40 years wandering around in that wilderness and repeating this cycle of giving into temptation, suffering the consequences, then being restored to God and reminded of his goodness, and then forgetting again, giving into temptation, suffering the consequences, so on and so forth. This cycle just keeps going. You know, some of us know this cycle because we've been living it, maybe even going on 40 years. One of the things that's happening in this moment of Jesus in the wilderness is he is rewriting this story, this defining story of his people. He is showing us the way to not get caught in this same cycle of temptation that Israel got caught in. And this is the way out. This is what Jesus shows us by holding on to the identity that God has already given us. Chosen, loved, enough. This is what gets us through. You know, 40 days sounds like a terribly long time to wander around in a desert, but it's a whole lot better than 40 years. Or maybe in the language of Colts fans, the rest of the season feels like a whole really long time to go without Anthony Richardson. But at least we're not the Jets, right? You know, the way that Jesus emerges from the wilderness is different than Israel too. Look at how Luke describes Jesus on the other side of those 40 days. He says, Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. See, what we see here is Jesus comes out of the wilderness stronger than he went in. And people all around him, they're spreading the news because they're trying to figure out, they're asking the question, what is this power that he is on? What is he on? And see, one of the aspects that is working in Jesus' life here is the power that comes when we are living from approval instead of living for approval. It was as surprising to them then as it is for us to see today. See, Jesus has this clarity of mission. We see in every situation, he doesn't seem to care what people think about what he's doing because he knows his identity. He has a power because he's living from approval, not for approval. And if we back up a bit, we see how this started with something significant that happened when Jesus was baptized. Remember those words that God spoke over him. You are my son, who I love, with whom I am well pleased. Now, the question that we need to ask here is, did Jesus not know this before? Of course he did. We actually have a story from when he was 12, when he said to his earthly parents, didn't you know I needed to be about my Father's business? Jesus, before this moment, already knew who he was. What's happening at the baptism of Jesus is he is having an experience with the Father. This week, my son was on fall break, like I'm sure many of your kids were as well. And I loved the extra time that gave us together as a family. He's in kindergarten, so we're just adjusting to this like you be away for the majority of the week business. And so we spent a few days, we got away to Michigan and stayed in a cabin. And everything about our trip looked really relaxing, but we have a 5-year-old and a 1-year-old, so it wasn't really. I mean, we came home very exhausted, but the effort of taking the trip was worth it, because of the slow moments that it gave us together, those fleeting moments. You know, I have a not super affectionate 5-year-old and an always on the go 1-year-old. And so the moments when they stop what they're doing and they come up and climb up onto my lap and ask me to snuggle them, those moments are so sweet. I love them. They love those moments. And I want you to picture a moment like that and think about this. When my kids are on my lap, when I am holding them, are they somehow now more my children because I'm hugging them? Think about it like this. When they're not with me, when they're off playing or when they're at the school, does that somehow make them less my children? Of course not. But what happens is when I pick them up, when we have that moment of connection, when I'm holding them, they are now experiencing their sonship. They are experiencing their daughtership. See, it's a status that is always true about them, but there's something that happens in the experience of it. This is what's going on for Jesus right here. As he's baptized, he is experiencing his status of being the beloved son. This is one of the reasons why baptism is such an important step, why Jesus invites us to follow in his example. It's also one of the reasons why we're going to do this together in a couple of weeks at the end of this journey. And maybe for you, it's time to take that step, to have that experience with God. If you've got questions, you can hit this QR code, come to one of those info meetings. We'd love to talk to you more about that. See, when times got tough, Jesus was able to look back at that experience, to give him the strength that he needed, to live from that approval. And we can do this too. But first, we're going to have to confront some things, to really wrestle with the question, am I living from approval or for approval? Because, this temptation to live for approval starts at a very young age for most of us. I was reminded of this recently as I was having a conversation with my son, and it reminded me of how my desire for approval became obvious around his age. See, when I was little, my best friends were all older than me, at least 2 years, some of them more than that. And during that time, I idolized them. I wanted to be just like them. I definitely wanted them to like me. And so there were several times because of that age gap. 2 years is a big deal when you're a kid. And so there were times where we'd be talking about things and they would start to talk about something that I didn't understand. And they would realize it. They would turn to me and say, "Do you know what that means?" And I'd try to play it off like, "Of course I do." And I can still remember those conversations so vividly because the desire for approval was so strong, even at that young age. And so a couple of weeks ago, when my son got off the bus and got into my car and started asking me some questions like, "Hey, Mom, what's the B word? And what's the A word?" I did what every parent does. I massively overcorrected from my own experience. I started thinking about those conversations as a kid where I felt all that embarrassment from not knowing what those words meant. And I decided I was going to set him up for a different experience. And so I said, "Well, buddy, the A word is ass. It's kind of a bad word for butt." And his face was about as shocked as my parents who were in the room and are hearing this story for the first time, as their faces look right now. He could not believe it. So we kept going through that conversation. And when I got done explaining those words, then his next question was, "So which of those words is badder?" And I was like, "Well, they're both bad, but probably the B word is badder of the two and is worse, And he thought about that for a moment, and then finally he declared, "Okay, cool. I'm going to tell my best friend all about the A word." Not exactly what I was going through for in that parenting moment. But we see, again, in him, the signs and symptoms of living for approval show up so early in our lives. They evolve over time, and the truth is they look a little different for each of us. For me these days, the desire for approval shows itself more in the moments when I find myself saying something that I don't even actually agree with because I think it's what the other person wants to hear. Or the temptation that I feel to buy 12 new things and panic clean my house when someone new is about to come over. Or the anxiety that creeps in when I sense that certain people don't approve of my actions or my decisions. Maybe for you, the desire for approval shows up more in kind of how much you pay attention to the activity and the likes on the comments on your last post. Or in your desire to have the newest and latest, to upgrade your phone, your car, your house, your boat. Maybe it shows up in the degree to which you let your friends influence your decisions or your tendency to overwork yourself. See, no matter how old we are, no matter how these symptoms of approval play out in our lives, the root feelings remain the same for all of us. When we are living for approval, we don't feel secure. We fear being abandoned. We always are wondering, is this the time that people are going to walk away? And failure feels like a death sentence. When we're living for approval, this is the value equation that we're operating out of. We think, if we're really honest, my performance plus other people's opinions equals my worth. And we get pretty good at adding things into those categories, at getting our performance to the level that it needs to be so that we can sway other people's opinions, so we can feel like we're worth it. But at some point, this equation falls apart for all of us. The good news is this is not our only option. There is a place where you can live from approval, a place where you can live in confidence, where you can genuinely feel like you belong, a place where you can make aggressive mistakes, a place called home. So where do you want to live? For approval or from approval? I had a conversation with a friend last week who had no idea that I was going to be talking about this weekend. And she was sharing with me essentially this, about how she was just starting to realize how much her desire for approval was taking control of her life. And she was trying to figure out how to find some freedom from that. And the reason she brought it up is she turned to me and she said, "You seem like you don't care about that at all. Is that true?" And I don't know what that says about me. I've been a little worried about it since, but what actually happened in that moment was this really important realization where I realized that it hasn't always been true, but it is in a way that I never thought I could get to. It really is true that the desire for approval doesn't have the hold on my life that it used to. It doesn't mean it never pops up. It doesn't mean I don't have other issues I'm working through. But this is a place where I've taken some serious ground over the past several years. And here's where it started. It started with getting really honest about where I was starting from. And so we're actually going to take a couple of minutes to do that together now. You can go ahead and take your guide back out. And if you're, just deciding, okay, maybe I really should go grab a guide, we've still got some in the back. And so feel free to get up and grab one. But go ahead and turn to page 45. And what you're going to see on here are some prompts that really are geared toward helping us see some of the places that we're not at home, where we might wrestle with approval so that we can invite God to help us to move forward in those areas. So Brad's going to play for us for a couple of minutes as we just take time to work through some of those. Don't feel like you need to fill in every blank, but I think it says, at least 3. If you can fill in someone's name with one of these blanks, let's take a minute and do that together. We're going to pull back together. If you're like me and you never have enough time to finish these in the time we give you, it's okay. You can go back to it later. But one of the surprising things for me as I started filling this out earlier this week One of the things that came up is on the very first line, actually, I found myself filling in the name of a person who's not even in my life anymore. This is a person that I don't see anymore, that I didn't even realize their approval was something that I still cared about, but apparently I do. Which leads us to something that I think that we need to name here. As you start to look over the list of the names that you just wrote into those blanks, you may be tempted to think that what you need is a change in environment. That if you could just get away from the people whose names you wrote down, that would solve the problem. But the truth is, a change in environment does not necessarily equal a change in the value system that we're living by. Sometimes a change in our environments or a shift in relationship is a part of the process that we need to go through. But that solution only gets us so far. The real goal here, what we're trying to get at, where this journey is leading us, is to get to a deeper level of work, to an internal shift that will make all the difference. The turning point here is really about receiving and trusting. Trusting what God says about you over and above the lies that you've come to believe, over and above the voices that are surrounding you, over and above the names of those people that you just wrote down on this list, over and above your current circumstances. See, living from approval is directly tied to learning how to trust God as your Heavenly Father. Paul, who is an early church leader, we talk a lot about around here, Paul was all about spreading the word that God is for all people, not just select people. He used this metaphor of adoption as a way to explain this turning point of receiving and trusting. And it's a powerful image. I've had the privilege of walking with a few friends to see the story of their adoption and their family unfold up close. Maybe you have too, or maybe it's a part of your own family's story. The truth is, adoption is never easy, but it is a profound example of love that has so much to teach us about God's posture toward us. Think about an adopted child. Because of an act of love and self-sacrifice, their identity gets changed entirely, completely, and permanently. In that moment, they become a part of a new family. If you have an adopted child, there was a moment where you said, I choose you. You are my son. You are my daughter, who I love, in whom I am well pleased. And you went to great lengths. You probably gave and endured more than anyone else will ever realize to bring that child into your family. This is exactly what God has done for you and me. This is the gospel of adoption. In one of his letters that we call Galatians, Paul describes it like this. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as his children. See, when Paul is writing this, the most famous examples of adoption were the three previous emperors of the Roman Empire: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula. Have you guys been following this? How often do you think about the Roman Empire trend on TikTok? And it's kind of all over the place now. If you're not familiar with it, there's basically this trend that got popular about a month ago, I think, that is about how many men spend a shocking amount of time thinking about the Roman Empire. It's like all these videos of women filming their boyfriends or their husbands and asking them, how often do you think about the Roman Empire? And like just these immediate responses of daily, all the time. And anyways, it's funny. You might want to check it out or not. But in my house, we didn't quite understand it. It took a little bit of digging for us to get this trend, because in our house, it's the opposite. I am the one that thinks about the Roman Empire probably on a daily basis. I kind of nerd out about it. And I had literally named my child Roman. So, but part of the reason why I care about this, part of the reason why I love learning about that world is the more we understand the world at that time, the more we can understand Jesus and the writers of the New Testament. And this is one example of this. See, what would have come to mind for everyone who first read these words from Paul was the dramatic change in status that adoption had brought about for those emperors. See, because they had been adopted as sons and heirs, they literally became the most powerful people in the world. Had they not been adopted, though, had their story gone in a different direction, they would have been killed, or at the very best, spent the rest of their lives on the run in fear of those who thought they might be a threat to power. See, for them, adoption was their only hope, and it brought about this dramatic change in status and potential. And so Paul is drawing on this metaphor to explain how Jesus came to make it possible for every one of us to receive this dramatic change in status, to unlock potential in us that we cannot access on our own, to give us a power that only God could offer us. If you ever want to know what you are worth, if you ever want to know what Jesus thinks about you, look no further than the cross. This is the loudest and clearest statement of what God thinks about you. The cross is about a parent fighting for custody of the children that he loves. It's a demonstration of the lengths that love will go, as God gave everything to demonstrate how desperately he wanted to be reconciled with you. It's a reminder to us that the cost of adoption is never the responsibility of the child. It is always and only the parent who bears the expense, who says to their son or daughter, "You're mine. You belong in this family. And there's nothing that you could do to make me love you more. There's nothing that you could do to make me love you less." This is the statement that God is making to us through the cross. And here's the thing. When you receive that adoption, your status changes in that very moment. This isn't about something we get someday. This isn't about something after you die. This is about what you get right now. See, Paul goes on to say, because you are his children, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who cries out, "Abba, Father." This is the power that gives us the ability to live from approval. And it's the same power that Jesus drew from, the power of the Spirit of God, given to us as our guide and ever-present companion. Paul goes on, so you are no longer a slave. You're no longer a slave to pleasing people. You're no longer a slave to the approval of that person that you've been trying to measure up to. You are no longer a slave to that person who has criticized you. No. You are God's child. And since you are his child, he has made you also an heir. See, the invitation has already been extended to you. And like every adoptive parent, God has been eagerly waiting for you, longing for you to be drawn in to his family, to experience all that comes with being a beloved son, a beloved daughter. The question is, will you trust? Will you trust that God is good and has good intentions for your life? Will you trust what God says is true about you over and above how you feel about yourself? Will you trust your dad to lead you home? There's this Cherokee proverb, maybe you've heard it before, about a grandson who had a dream, and he went to his grandfather to help interpret it. His dream was about a battle between two wolves, and he asked his grandfather, he goes to his grandfather, and his grandfather says to him, "Son, These two wolves that you're seeing in your dream, they're actually inside of you. For our purposes, think about it like this. There's one voice inside of you that is the voice of the accuser. The voice that says you will never measure up. You need to fight for approval wherever you can find it. But there's also another voice, another wolf within you, the voice of God. This is the voice that says, I thought of you before the world was ever made. The voice that says, I'm coming for you. I want to adopt you. I've already made the way. The voice that says, you can come home. And so in the proverb, the grandson asks the grandfather, well, which wolf wins the war? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. The one you feed, that's the voice that wins. The question for us to wrestle with this week, which voice will you listen to? Are you going to listen to the voice that always is trying to get you to seek approval, that's trying to convince you that you don't belong? Or will you listen to the voice of our Father who's saying, come on home? The band is going to lead us in one more song. And this song really is an anthem about coming home. As you listen to it, as you sing along with these words, know that your heavenly Father wants you to experience, even now, even in this moment, how deeply loved you are. As the song describes, there is nowhere we can go that God's love cannot reach. And you can make a decision right now to receive and trust, to make a turn toward home. And so let's stand together and sing and take in these words.
Thanks so much for joining us today. Take a moment to follow our podcast on your preferred platform and be sure to download our app to stay informed on everything happening here at Crosspoint. And if you like what you heard today, don't hesitate to share it with a friend that might need to hear it too.